Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our second day of And Diverse Are Their Hues, Color in Islamic Art and Culture. For those of us, and I think many of us were here last night, it was a lovely evening. I hope you're not suffering the effects of too much food and too late an evening. We have a very full and very exciting program today. Let me just begin with a very few brief remarks about practical matters. Lunch is included for all people who are participating. Anyone who has registered for the symposium, there is lunch. It will be served here in this building. We will also be having a coffee break. And by the time of the coffee break, there will be set up outside a table with books written and published by many of the speakers here. They are available for purchase. You can use a credit card or you can use euros in cash. We cannot take checks, but they will be set up outside and you can take a look at them and see what is available. There will also be available the proceedings from the previous conference, Rivers of Paradise, that was held in Doha 2 years ago. Absolutely, I have to say, smashing book. I was the editor, but one of the editors with Jonathan Bloom. It looks lovely, and the same will be true 2 years from now when we hold our next conference in Doha. We will have the papers from this conference ready for sale 2 years from now. Some of you have asked, will they be available on the web? No, they will be available in splendid color 2 years from now. Today and tomorrow, our papers will all be delivered in English. English is the designated language, but we do have headsets available for anyone who wants to listen. We have Spanish translation available. The headsets are right outside the door. Anyone who needs to should go and get one right now. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, the School of the Arts, Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar, VCU Qatar, and also the Qatar Foundation, who have all generously supported this splendid event. And finally, I would very much like to thank the people who you don't see. Many people have told me how wonderfully this conference is running. Everything is extremely efficient and smooth. And that's because you haven't seen our busy little worker bees who have been working nonstop to get this on the road. So a special thanks to Andrew and Teresa Ilnicki, Dawn Waters, Jess Sumter, Dan Grenier, and Donna Duffett, who really have been working for 2 years to get this going. And especially to Marissa Brown. And I would really like to have a round of applause for all of these people. And now, having told you their names, I'll give you a little clue. We all have colored badges. The people in blue are the people I've just named, and they're the ones, if you have questions or can't find something, they'll be the ones who'll be able to guide you in the right direction. We have one more special thing. Each of our speakers will be briefly introduced by a student, either from VCU in Richmond or VCU in Qatar. So it's my pleasure to begin by introducing Carrie Brown, who will introduce our first speaker this morning. Thank you.
Alhambra. Completed towards the end of the 14th century, this palace complex served as the residence and court for Muslim rulers of southern Spain at the time. It's fitting we begin our symposium on the use of color in Islamic art and culture with a site whose literal translation means the red one. Our first speaker today is Dr. Olga Bush, a specialist on the Islamic art of medieval Spain. Currently, Dr. Bush is a professor of Islamic art at Vassar College. Her recent research focuses on the vibrant art and architecture in Alhambra. Her talk today, Designs Always Polychromed or Gilded, the Aesthetics of Color in the Alhambra, takes a closer look at the role of color at this site. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Olga Bush.
Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'd like to add my thanks to the Qatar Foundation, Virginia Commonwealth University, and to the organizers, Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom. Antes de empezar, quiero agradecerles a la Fundación Qatar, la Universidad Virginia Commonwealth, y también Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom por organizar este simposio. In a recent interview with French painter François Morellet, given in connection with the exhibition titled Color Chart, Reinventing Color 1950 to Today at the Tate Gallery, Liverpool this fall, the artist comments on his work called Random Distribution of 40,000 Squares using the odd and even numbers of a telephone directory. Morellet explains the process of painting random distribution in its initial version in 1960. Quote, I drew horizontal and vertical lines to make 40,000 squares. Then my wife and my sons would read out the numbers from the phone book, and I would mark each square for an even number while leaving the odd ones blank. The crossed squares were blue and the blank ones red, end of quote. The random sequence challenges the rationality of the underlying grid and hence the canons of Western painting. But in addition to the interplay with geometry, Morellet further attests that the properties of the colors themselves were manipulated to foment a particular visual experience. Speaking of the three-dimensional installation version of 1963, he states, quote, I wanted to create a dazzling fight between two colors that share the same luminosity. I wanted the visitors to have a disturbing experience when they walked into this room, to almost hurt their eyes with the pulsating, flickering balance of two colors. The theoretical issues of artistic conception and visual perception in the use of color and its relation to geometry will be my primary focus. But I know that Morellet also recalls the pictorial sources of his random distribution in more conventional art historical terms. He cites his early enthusiasm for Shahinian tapas, quote, with their repetition of printed shapes, end of quote, followed by his encounter with contemporary concrete art, and finally he recalls, quote, my third major shock came from the abstract Islamic networks of lines and repetitive pattern all over the walls of the Alhambra Palace in Granada on my first visit in 1952. I will investigate that shock. But I turn from the contemporary experience of Morellet or our own to the aesthetic experience of the Alhambra as it would have presented itself in the Nasrid period in 14th century Al-Andalus. Indeed, I hope to make that experience stand forth as all the more shocking by coupling the impact of the networks of lines and repetitive pattern cited by Morellet to that of the vibrant colors that overlay the well-studied geometric design. For as Nasrid court poet and vizier Ibn al-Jayyab wrote in verses inscribed in the interior of the Kalahura al-Jadida, a tower palace in the Alhambra, quote, wherever you look, there are different designs, always either polychromed or gilded, end of quote. My argument for the indispensability of color to the understanding of the aesthetics of the Alhambra requires two preliminary steps. First, given the state of conservation in which the interior halls of the palaces and the spacious arcaded courtyards now appear mostly devoid of color above the dados of ceramic tile mosaics, it will be necessary to provide a historical assessment of the extent, variety, and sources of color in the decoration of the Alhambra. Second, I will consider medieval Muslim science with respect to visual perception as a theoretical foundation for the use of color and its relation to geometric design in the decoration of the Alhambra. Here, the task is hampered by the lack of historical documentation. Nevertheless, it would be more absurd to imagine the builders and artisans of 14th century Granada under the patronage of the Nasrid dynasty producing the magnificent decoration of the Alhambra in a vacuum, than to speculate about the salient elements of their cultural context, including the science of their day. Hence, scholarly discussion culminating in the work of Antonio Fernandez Puertas does not ascribe the extraordinary coherence of geometrical design in the architecture and decoration of the Alhambra to a random distribution of ratios, as it were, even if it has not been possible to connect particular mathematical texts or architectural manuals to specific workshops. With regard to medieval Islamic optics, the picture, in fact, is clearer. For the chief figure is well known, Ibn al-Haytham, a mathematician born in present-day Iraq who lived much of his life in Fatimid Cairo and died in 1040. Well versed in the arts and sciences of classical antiquity, especially in the fields of geometry, optics, philosophy, and aesthetics. This is not the occasion to rehearse the history of transmission of his Kitab al-Manazir, Book of Optics, but I recall Hans Belting's recent summary that with respect to the Muslim elite of Al-Andalus, that work was, quote, in everyone's hands, end of quote. My second step, then, will be to consider design principles in the relation of color to geometry in the Alhambra in the light of his optics, drawing further on recent work in neurobiology. To register the shock of color in the Alhambra, one might well look to the baths of the Palace of Comares, long off limits to visitors. Rafael Contreras undertook the restoration of the original colors on stucco and wood in 1827, producing what one scholar called, quote, a hall of unexpected marvels, end of quote. Scholarly consensus, however, rejects the bright and glistening hues of Contreras' restoration, such as his use of ultramarine or Prussian blue, and his extensive gilding as an underinformed and overzealous treatment in the spirit of Romanticism. On the other hand, recent study has determined that in much the same period, restoration work eliminated the polychromy of 129 out of 130 column capitals in the Court of the Lions. It appears that José Contreras, the architect in charge of the Alhambra at that time, mistook the oxidized gold leaf for a residue of accumulated dirt. The latter approach resulted in the blanched austerity associated with Western classicism in much of the modern period and still vaunted in tourist materials for Granada. But the repudiated restoration of the bath, if inaccurate, is nevertheless closer to rendering the overall impression of the 14th century Alhambra, a site of intense, even overwhelming color. One may also look to the attempt to reconstruct the colors by Owen Jones in the plates made from his numerous drawings of the Alhambra during his visits there in 1834 and 1837, for a striking contrast to the Alhambra of today. The impression may be elaborated and strengthened. For in fact, Ibn al-Jayyab's poetic description of the polychromed interior has been corroborated by recent technical studies of stucco fragments from the Alhambra in which the pigments and their sources were identified with the aid of Raman microscopy and optical microscopy. The red pigment was obtained from one of two sources, cinnabar, a natural compound mined in Spain, or vermilion, artificially produced mercuric sulfide. The blue pigment was obtained from lazurite, which forms the bulk of the gemstone lapis lazuli, and which, when ground coarsely and mixed with hematite, produced an intense blue hue. Although the green pigment in the Alhambra was not analyzed in the studies, it is possible to infer that a mixture of ground malachite and copper was used on the basis of the examination of stucco at an earlier Nasrid palace in Granada. Red and blue pigments were consistently employed for the background elements in stucco. Gold leaf was applied to foreground forms, epigraphy among them, and black, turquoise, and green were used for details. A textual source written in 1362 by Ibn al-Khatib, vizier at the Nasrid court, recorded that the parietal epigraphy in the Alhambra was painted with gold, while lapis lazuli, lazuart, was used to paint the space between the letters. Further technical analysis has produced similar findings in the study of wooden surfaces in the Alhambra. Maria Carmen Lopez Pertiñez has identified some sources of the colors employed in the background: lapis lazuli for blue pigment, mercury sulfide for vermilion red, a mixture of copper, salt, and vinegar for dark green, and orpiment for yellow. Details on stucco and wood were rendered in greenish blue, black, and white pigments, for which the sources have been identified as lazurite, vegetal-based charcoal, and lead carbonate, respectively. In addition, gold leaf was used in the rendering of the foreground decorative elements, such as the foliate motifs and the artesonado ceiling of the Hall of Comares. While stucco and wood are ubiquitous in the palatial complex, the ceiling of the Mirador de Lindaraja is the only precinct in which some of the original colored glass remains in the present-day Alhambra. The number of colors in the glass ceiling is limited to 4: red, blue, yellow, and green, corresponding to the main colors employed in the polychromed stucco and wood. Not only the color scheme similar, but it is also probable that the sources of the pigments were the same for glass as for other media. A recently discovered 8th century treatise by Jabr ibn Hayyan, an acclaimed chemist, contains many recipes for coloring glass, and so indicates that already during the early Abbasid period, cinnabar was used for red, arsenic and sulfur for yellow, and copper for green. Because the lower temperature resistance of lapis lazuli rendered the material unsuitable for coloring glass, cobalt ore was used to produce a similar blue pigment in this medium, in contrast to stucco and wood. It may be noted in passing that not only did Jabr ibn Hayyan's treatise become a source for similar later works composed in Arabic and Latin through the 13th century, but also his understanding of the relationship between pigments and the temperature of chemical reactions allowed him to propose a method for coloring gemstones, which was patented 13 centuries later in 2006 in the United States. Finally, it would appear that the pigments used for coloring glass were also employed in the glazes of ceramic tile mosaics, since Al-Biruni, among other writers, noted that, quote, glass, enamel, and ceramics are close to each other, and they have common techniques in pigments and methods of coloring. Thus, for example, cobalt was employed in the ceramic production in the Alhambra, both in some of the tiles and in the lusterware. Technical information on pigments in the Alhambra remains limited to date, yet it suffices to revise the impression left by the loss of color due to the effects of time or misguided restoration. It is necessary, therefore, to reimagine the Alhambra in an Andalusian tradition that includes the multicolored glass mosaics of the mihrab in the Great Mosque of Cordova, along with its domes, polychromed wooden ceiling, red and white visuars, and marble columns. The polychromed carved stucco and glass in the palace of Al-Ma'mun in Toledo, and a pavilion he built of colored glass, and the colored glass in the Al-Hafariya palace of Ibn Hud in Saragossa. One must reconstruct the aesthetic experience of the 14th century beholder in the Alhambra amidst great surfaces of rich and varied colors in virtually every facet of the architectural decoration: cupolas, flat ceilings and doors made of wood, glass vaults and the windows of the upper stories, the carved stucco panels that cover the expanse of the walls and the stucco muqarna vaults, marble and stucco capitals, and the ceramic tile mosaic in the dados on the walls and in the floors. The effort of imagination necessary to reconstruct the colors of the architectural decoration is facilitated, of course, by the extant dados of ceramic tile mosaics, today the most colorful and best preserved surfaces in the Alhambra. But even here, scholarly attention has focused rather on geometric design. Mathematicians in the field of fractal geometry, for instance, have lately contributed the important finding that all of the possible two-dimensional symmetry groups discovered by plain crystallographic group theory and limited to 17 in number are employed in the ceramic tile mosaics of one or another precinct in the Alhambra. But inasmuch as fractal geometry was unknown to the medieval world and the pertinent developments in crystallography awaited the discovery of X-ray, the same scholars have proposed that the builders and artisans of the Alhambra were able to, quote, to carry out the designs empirically, end of quote, which is very nearly to say a random distribution of trials and errors. In the absence of documented knowledge of mathematical principles, contemporary scholars claim no more than intuitive knowledge as a basis for design. The narrow cultural scope framing that mathematical research is broadened in a study that takes color into account. That is where geometric patterns were examined through the lens of symmetry-based coloring schemes. The scholars concluded that the Nasrid artisans had understood and used the principles of what crystallographers term dichroic or polychromatic patterns. Understanding of the design principles may be advanced, however, by reversing the historical perspective. Rather than study the medieval decoration as a distant and incomplete prefiguration to be fulfilled by modern knowledge, one may suppose that the designs manifested the state of knowledge of their own times. The inseparable relation of color and geometry, then, would be an expression of the understanding of visual perception as it was conceived in the medieval period. That understanding was best expressed, at least as far as the extant documents are concerned, by Ibn al-Haytham's groundbreaking 11th century treatise on visual perception, the Kitab al-Manazir, Book of Optics. Based on ocular anatomy, intromission theory, mathematics, and the interrelations of various cognitive processes, Ibn al-Haytham's optics explicated the psychological apparatus involved in seeing and comprehending a visual object. In the most basic terms, he outlined a two-step process. The first involves the perception of an object by the optical system. The second involves the comprehension of the object through the agency of psychological operations of cognition that engage the faculty of judgment or of discernment. Ibn al-Haytham then enumerated the visible properties of an object, 22 in all, in relation to that two-step process. Light and color are distinguished from all other properties as susceptible to be perceived through pure sensation. The remaining properties, such as distance, shape, and size, or contrasting pairs like similarity, dissimilarity, and motion, rest, require the subsequent and supplementary intervention of judgmental perception, which employs various mental operations such as contemplation, comparison, deduction, and inference. On the basis of this two-step process, combining physiology and psychology in what he calls true perception, Ibn al-Haytham offers corollaries with a direct bearing on aesthetics. He postulates that the beauty of an object can be produced in several ways: by a single visible property, the cumulative effect of several visible properties, each of them beautiful, and finally, by a harmonious interrelationship of several visible properties that may lack beauty in themselves. He states, quote, "Beauty is therefore produced by the particular properties, but its completion and perfection is due only to the proportionality and harmony that may obtain between the particular properties," end of quote. Reference to proportionality of part in regard to shape, size, position would seem to align beauty with geometric design, and scholarship in Islamic art has indeed tended to assign geometry a leading role. But Ibn al-Haytham immediately adds, quote, "and all the other properties required by proportionality," end of quote, which moves beyond elements conducive to linear measure to include a broader understanding of commensurability. It is pertinent to recall in this regard that the notion of commensurability had been addressed by earlier Muslim texts and aesthetics, and that in addition to the proportionality of shapes and sizes, the Brethren of Purity specifically mentioned the proportionality of colors needed to render a painted picture beautiful. As concerns the aesthetics of color, Ibn al-Haytham asserts, quote, "Bright and pure colors and designs are more beautiful when regularly and uniformly ordered than when they have no regular order," end of quote. This dictum allows a process of discernment with pure sensation. Colors may be more or less pure, for instance, and so the possibility of perceiving beauty in the first step of the act of seeing alone. The single property of color may be beautiful in its purity, and the cumulative effect of the visible properties of color and light, combined as luminosity or value, might also be perceived as beautiful. But the completion and perfection of beauty with respect to color will not be achieved through pure sensation in itself, but rather will engage the secondary processes of discernment that are necessary to bring order to color. Not the richly colored surface, then, but the colored surface organized by geometrical design is the aesthetic foundation of the architectural decoration of the Alhambra. This conclusion upholds the more general observation of OLGA that geometry plays a crucial role not only in design, but also in determining the mode of perception. But Ibn al-Haytham's two-step optical process leads to a further postulate, and with it, a shift in emphasis. Since the judgments involved in discerning geometric design are secondary to the perception of color, according to Ibn al-Haytham, one may also study such visible properties as shape and size, separation and continuity, motion and rest, as dependent upon the use of color. The Alhambra lends itself to corresponding case studies. I limit myself here to two analyses. One of the dados of ceramic tile mosaics, which is to say surfaces on which the colors are well preserved, and another in which the foregoing historical reconstruction permits a new understanding of an architectural space. While concentrating on geometrical variations of the dados of ceramic tile mosaics in the Alhambra, Fernández Puertas makes a valuable observation with respect to color. He remarks that the geometric designs were further transformed through the use of color, which generated, quote, entirely new schemes to the eye, which often and to a large extent hide the basic geometric schemes, end of quote. The crucial point is clearly borne out in the decoration and will be examined here. One may consider, for example, the designs that include a geometric element, which for the modern eye might be referred to as propellers. A panel of dados in the Bait al-Maslaj, Sala de las Camas, in the baths of the Palace of the Comares, is composed of horizontal rows of propellers, which alternate between black and green, with one row in yellow ochre color that serves as an axis of symmetry in the composition. Every second row in the panel consists of white propellers, perceived merely as a background for the other contrasting colors. While it is possible to discern a pattern of alternating white diagonals, the employment of darker colors, especially of black, guides our reading as a pattern of horizontal rows. When this panel is compared to the dados of ceramic tile mosaics in the niche in the northwest corner of the patio of Comares, one perceives a very distinct design, despite the identical geometric composition. Here, the rows of white propellers may be perceived horizontally, but the four colors, black, green, blue, and yellow ochre, are predominant over the white grid, so that the panel appears rather as a more complex diagonal composition. Since the beholder perceives the pure sensation of color differing from row to row before the similarity in the geometric element of the propellers, the observer's eye races along the rows of color, recognizing a repeated pattern. A certain dynamism is thus achieved, such as one finds reflected in the words of Ibn al-Khatib, who in 1362 described the dados of ceramic tile mosaics elsewhere in the Alhambra as an, quote, undulating sea, end of quote. This design in particular seems to have made an impact on Morlaix as well when he composed his pattern of colored crosses staggered diagonally on the canvas. Executed in 1953, 1 year after his sojourn to the Alhambra, the painter calls the beholder's attention to colors in the title of the painting: violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. The undulating effect of the dados is lost through the elimination of the white grid and the use of the more stable monochromatic elements. When the color was manipulated further in the ceramic tile mosaics in the Patio of Comares, yet another perceptibly distinct design emerged. The dados of the two lateral niches in the Patio of Comares are identical, except for one panel in the niche in the northwest corner. In this panel, some of the propeller elements appear in black, whereas they appear in various colors in the corresponding places in the design discussed above. As Ibn al-Haytham observed, we differentiate between an object's color and that of its surroundings, which is to say that distinctions in color serve to mark what he calls the boundaries of the objects and of the intervals between the boundaries, end of quote. The use of black in this panel, whether understood as a distinct color or an interval between bounded colors, transforms the undulating rows into a lattice grid. In one horizontal row, a cell filled with blue elements alternates with that filled with yellow elements, and in the second row, all cells are filled with elements in green. Well, I must reserve for a separate occasion the question as to why the panel was executed with a distinct design. What is already clear from considering these examples is that differences in color, and especially the use of black and white, lead to different readings of otherwise similar or even identical geometric designs in the dados of ceramic tile mosaics. Although the paucity of traces of pigments in other media in the Alhambra presents an obstacle to current research, recollection that the decoration was always polychromed and gilded makes it possible to consider the effect of color on such surfaces as the Muqarna vault in the hall of the Abencerrajes. Ibn al-Haytham explains that we perceive the volume, or solidity as he calls it, of an object because the light it reflects renders the surfaces as bent, convex, or concave, where some parts appear lighter to the eye and others darker or shadowed. The penetration of light through the paired windows at the dome's star-shaped base and its movement along the vault over the course of the day would in itself create the effect of alternating lighter and darker areas, enabling the discernment of the Muqarna tiers. But the perception of the complex, highly textured surface of the vault would have been greatly enhanced by the application of red, blue, and gold pigments, the traces of which are visible today. The alternation of warm and cold colors, perceived as a variation between darker and lighter areas in the vault, also contributes to what Ibn al-Haytham discusses as the separation and contiguity of the constitutive parts of the object, or in this case, of individual Muqarna elements, putting in relief the numerous and varied volumes. Following Ibn al-Haytham's postulation, it becomes evident that the color contrast would contribute to the perception of the multiple relationships between numerous Muqarna elements with regard to their size, position, shape, and distance, and would lead to the discernment of the order within the tiered composition of the vault. Thus, the simultaneous manipulation of color and geometry through these relationships would lead the viewer to the discernment of the complex spatial construction of the vault, in which the Muqarna tiers spiral in a cone-shaped vortex to its apex, producing a dizzying kinetic effect. Ibn al-Haytham's two-step process of the perception of light and color, followed by the discernment of other visual properties, can be supplemented by recourse to current work in neurobiology. Margaret Livingston offers closely related findings when she demonstrates how the different aspects of visual information are processed through two distinct neurological systems. One system, which she calls the what system, is responsible for the perception of color and recognition of objects, while the other, the where system, is responsible for the perception of space, motion, position, depth, figure ground segregation, and the overall composition or organization of the visual field. The very same visible properties of objects were evaluated and discussed by Ibn al-Haytham. Livingston's explication enables a further comment on the kinetic effects to which the use of color contributes, such as discussed with regard to the vault in the hall of the Abencerrajes. The masking of geometry might now best be understood as a disruption of the where system. A historical source offers a point of departure. In describing his visit to Al-Mamun's palace in Toledo, constructed by the Taifa ruler sometime in the mid-11th century, Ibn al-Khabir reported that if one looked at the figures in the architectural decoration fixedly, the beholder was rewarded with the sensation that the forms, quote, moved or made signs to him, end of quote. The recent excavations on the site of the palace uncovered fragments of stucco decoration carved with figural motifs and painted with lapis lazuli and gold. One may imagine alternating colors and an impression of undulation in the decoration at the palace of Al-Ma'mun, parallel to that attested by Ibn al-Khatib in the Alhambra. Moholet's random distribution opens a new avenue for research in this respect. It will be recalled that the painter deliberately sought to create a visually disturbing experience through what he described as, quote, a dazzling fight between two colors that shared the same luminosity, end of quote. Livingston provides the theoretical explication. For instance, although the color itself is perceived by the what system, the where system, which is insensitive to color, perceives a color's luminosity or value. When the where system compares different colors on the basis of their luminosity, it can arrive at a conclusion with regard to our perception of depth, three-dimensionality, composition, and motion. The contemplation of Moholet's random distribution causes our where system to perceive the surfaces as vibrating and unstable, not because of the difference in hue, red and blue, but rather because the colors are equal in brightness, that is, luminosity, and the where system cannot assign relative positions in depth to equiluminant colors. Moholet exploits this shortcoming of the where system to create the pulsating, flickering balance of two colors. The disorienting of spatial perception in the flat painting becomes truly shocking when he redesigned random distribution as a three-dimensional installation. The added architectural dimension of the installation gives some sense in our contemporary experience of the experience of the 14th century beholder in the polychromed and gilded spaces of the Alhambra. Moholet's work leads to one final observation relevant to Nasrid craftsmanship. The inclusion of an electric bulb in this installation version of random distribution gives a clear indication of his engagement with the science of optics of his moment. More than a passing reference to contemporary technologies, the bulb points to the painter's awareness that artificial light enhances the red squares, whereas natural light enhances the blue. Recent technical analysis of surfaces in the Alhambra leads to a similar inference. Stucco, a primary decorative material in the Alhambra, was made from gypsum to which powdered marble or eggshell was added in order to make it harder. I now further know that the additives would give a greater reflective surface to the material and hence a base that would give greater luminosity to the colors applied to the stucco. Technical analysis has already revealed that blue and red pigments in the parietal painting in the Alhambra were applied to a special undercoating which would have affected their luminosity. Furthermore, the analysis of Nazarite carpentry shows that in order to give greater luminosity to the finished polychromed surface, it was first covered with a layer of unpolished plaster and then a layer of burnished tin, after which a thin layer of lead white and calcium carbonate was applied under the blue and red pigments. Where documentary proof is lacking, these findings, I suggest, provide evidence at the level of craft that speaks to the awareness of the science of optics in the period. The consequences for visual perception were incorporated in the decoration of the Alhambra. When the investigation of color attains a place on the agenda of the Alhambra research, now accorded to the study of geometry, and for instance, technical analysis provides further information on the luminosity of the pigments that remain on such surfaces as the vault of the hall of the Abencerrajes, it may be possible to assess further the signs made to the beholder by the polychromed and gilded decoration were vibrating on the basis of equal luminosity, and then to surmise more about the artistic intent and the level of scientific knowledge that went into the design. What I may anticipate for now is that as we reconstruct the colors of the Alhambra and come to understand the optics of the design and its kinetic effects, we will need to reconsider our presuppositions about architecture as an embodiment of stability in the Nazareth palatial complex, when its experience may well have been one of constant, kaleidoscopic, multicolored motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. I thought that was an absolutely superb introduction to many of the themes that we're going to be coming back to again and again today. I thought it was wonderful to situate us in Andalusia, and we should, of course, thank the city of Cordova and the university here for also hosting this wonderful event and sponsoring the banners, which you've seen all over town. I'd also like to thank Mohammed Zakaria for his calligraphy, which you've seen on every scale possible, from bags to banners to notepads. I'm trying to stick to the schedule in my American fashion as much as possible, but we have a few minutes. So if we have a few questions we would like to pose to Olga, are there any other questions? Do people have specific questions related to her? We will have a more general discussion at the end of the day. Any questions? And it's quite hard to see up here. Any specific questions? Yes? Edie, okay.
I'll try and speak slowly and loudly.
Excellent.
Okay. Olga, my question, thank you for your paper. It was fascinating, both with respect to the Alhambra, but also this discussion of geometry and color and how they work in collaboration. My question is specifically with regards to the azulejos in the Alhambra, given that so much reconstruction occurred not only by Contreras, but also Torres Balbás. Can we be sure with the azulejos that we're looking at original patterns, or are some of them really kind of recreated in the style of the 13th and 14th century? How do we know?
Thank you, Didi, for your kind words, and thank you for a question. It's a very good question, and I know you told me yesterday your new project is working on the restoration work in the Alhambra. There has been quite a bit of research done, and of course, after we know pretty well in which areas the azulejos are original, in which areas the azulejos is a 19th century reconstruction, and actually one of the Contreras reconstructions, which was done in plaster and then colored, was just analyzed by Antonio Orihuela Usal in Granada, and came out with, he just published a very, very interesting article about it, about the whole process and sort of the basis on which Contreras made this restoration and why it was easier to do it in plaster and then just paint it. And it was done so well in so many precincts that it's actually hard to notice that they're in plaster rather than azulejos, rather than ceramics. So the areas that I chose to talk about today are the originals. So there's archival material that really tells us about it. And someone else who worked a lot, of course, on the determining the original azulejos and the later renovations and reconstruction is Carlos Vilches, who kind of wrote a big volume on Torres Balbás' work. So, but the areas that I chose are original. And you can actually see, as this summer I spent a lot of time looking at all the azulejos, you can actually see the difference between the original and the 19th century. Sort of the colors are not quite the same, and the 19th centuries are quite shinier. So.
We had one more question way in the back. Yep. Yep. Yes. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Do you know something about the fresco pigments in the Alhambra? There are certain areas with fresco painting. What kind of pigments do you know, tiny original paintings on the walls? Yeah. Like Peinador de la Reina or, you know, Partal?
There are people who do work on the paintings and the parietal paintings, and I mentioned very briefly that the original paintings in the Alhambra, in the original paintings, the same pigments are used as in the decoration of stucco. So the blue is basically based on lapis lazuli with hematite, and red is usually either a cinnabar or vermilion. So we do know about the pigments in green. And also other places in the Alhambra were analyzed as well. So other, not in the Alhambra, in 19th century Granada where pigments remain, and they're all consistent. You're welcome.
And I think there was one more, Heather Ecker, I saw a hand.
I really loved your paper. Thank you so much. It was really great. I have a question, which is a typical question about the Alhambra and the relation of textiles that are usually associated with the Alhambra and their colors. Because what was interesting is really you find exactly the same colors, green, red, blue, and yellow in silk textiles, which are associated with the Alhambra. And I wondered, I was so interested in this discussion of the kinetic effects of the instability of design motifs, and I'm not sure that you see the same thing in textiles, and I wanted to know your opinion.
It's a good question. I've been working on the textiles for a while now in the connection with the decoration of the Alhambra, and I think the colors are very similar, the designs are very similar, and everyone who works on the decoration of the Alhambra and the textiles pretty much agrees on that. And what struck me about the luxury textiles, the Nasrid luxury textiles, that all of them are silk. The examples that we have, there are very, very few, but they're well preserved and they're silk. And when you examine them firsthand, the silk is so fine, the weave is so fine, the silks are so thin, that if you imagine them hung, and we do have only one historical text, also by Ibn al-Khatib, who else, describing the ceremony of Mawlid in 1362 and the employment of textiles. And you can imagine the precincts actually decorated with textiles and the arcade hung with textiles. And if you think how thin they are, that the lightest wind will blow them and they will be kind of in constant motion as well. So I don't know whether it's an answer to your question, but it just made me think when you asked about it, about the kinetic effect, sort of the dynamic effect that it adds. And of course, another kind of dynamic effect to the relationship between the decoration and the textiles would be that these places would be full of people, the precincts, the halls, the hallways, the corridors, and so on. And the curtains would be constantly lifted and lowered as people entered and exited. So that would add another dimension.
Thank you. I think, Olga, we should say thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you again, and thank you for your questions. Thank you. That was terrific.